you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Yunus. It's a pleasure to be back here after a few years. I can see some friends, some familiar faces. I can also understand that there are some young graduates here in the room. So congratulations on your very special day, and I wish you all the best for your new life after the MBA. It's really a commencement. So hopefully the more interesting is coming. And just one thing I want you just to keep in mind, don't forget the famous Celia Russo saying, we are in business to make a better world. And this is totally linked to the topic of the discussion today. So I will be talking about the future of finance in Africa, and more specifically talking about fintechs and sustainable finance. These are two trends that are emerging on the continent, and hopefully we will be linking this to the global discussion on circular economy. I want to start first with some general view about the continent and the change in the perception. Maybe you have seen the following picture. It's the front page of The Economist, the famous British newspaper. And what is interesting to see here is the change. Basically, we are moving from one vision to the other one. In the 90s, it was all about Afro-pessimism. Africa is a hopeless continent. It's all about disease and so on. Basically, you can do nothing. Then in the beginning of the millennial, then there was a change. Well, we are talking how can we help the continent? Basically, what can be done? What's the role of the United Nations, funds and so on, NGOs? And now, since 2010, we are talking about trade. Basically, Africa is rising. How can businesses leverage this opportunity and do business? And maybe some of you are doing or want to do business in Africa, and there is this term that is often mentioned about VUCA. What is VUCA? Africa is VUCA, so no one knows exactly. So let's have a look. And here, actually, you will have two visions. You will have the pessimistic vision, telling you about Africa is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So basically, you will be silly to go and do business there. And on the other end of the spectrum, you will have people telling you, look, it's versatile, it's unique, it's very competitive, it's ambitious. It's go there, it's the last frontier, you can do business there, and it will be working. So somehow, maybe the reality is between these two ends of the spectrum. Well, there is clearly an African potential. If you have just, maybe you have already seen this illustration, but Africa is literally big. It's so big that it can fit US, Europe, China, India. I just think that I forgot something here. Madagascar is so big that it can face the UK. There is, of course, this momentum on natural resources. This is true. You have a huge reserves in terms of mining, in terms of arable lands. 60% of the arable lands worldwide that are not used are in Africa. However, it's not just about natural resources. There are demographic dividends. By 2034, you will have a working population in Africa exceeding India and China. So basically, this demographic dividend is very appealing, especially that it is combined as well with the urbanization trend. Basically, roughly half of the population will be living in cities, and this will bring opportunities in terms of how these smart cities can be developed in the continent. Also, there is an emerging middle class. Basically, Africans, as they are more numerous, as they are urban, they are also having more purchasing power. We are talking about 65% of the household which will have this purchasing power of $5,000 in purchasing powers in the upcoming years. And also, in terms of general trends, the governance, the doing business climate is overall improving on the continent. And last, there is an economic growth. In 2018, just to take the figure, 6 out of the 10 most performing economies worldwide were based in Africa. So clearly there is a momentum here and there is a potential. However, and it's important to mention this to balance the picture, it's a promising but complex and really fragmented continent. If you think about it, Africa is huge, yes, but it's not a monolithic block. You have different regions with different dynamics, 54 countries. Each of them are having its own specificities on cultural, legal, and regulatory frameworks. We'll be talking about that later on. So clearly the critical mass is not there, especially if you think about just one block that is not integrated economically speaking. There is a proportion of intra-African trade which is not really developed, and this is one of the challenges. It's small size, actually. If you take the entire continent, which has a GDP which is similar to Brazil, and last but not least, there remains some challenges in terms of connectivity, in terms of logistics. Just to give you a figure, if you want to ship container from one harbor to another one in Africa, it might take you longer, and by far, than to ship it into Asia, for instance. So, but clearly there is a paradigm here changing, and the continent is on the move. Basically, the continent is trying to move from one resource-intensive economy, and here we are seeing things moving, of course, to US, to Europe, but also to China. We can talk about China, Africa later on, to a more diversified, more innovative economies in the continent. And the presentation from Omar was very instrumental in trying to catch some of these trends. What I would like to highlight in this presentation is two promising trends in the financial industry in Africa. The first one is on fintech, and the other one is on green and sustainable finance. So fintech, let's start with fintech. You probably know this gentleman, and this gentleman is the CEO of JP Morgan, James Dimon. And in a letter to investors a couple of years ago, he used to say, when I go to Silicon Valley, they all want to eat our lunch. Every single one of them is going to try. A lot of them will succeed. They are very good at reducing the pain points in that they make loans in minutes where we take risks. So obviously, he is very right. And this is telling about the fintech dynamic worldwide. Well, to a certain extent, this is true in Africa, but it has its own specificity. And to start with, well, there is a big pain point in Africa, meaning that millions are excluded in terms of financial inclusion. Africa has roughly 400 million inhabitants that are not having a basic access to banking in terms of banking penetration. And if you take some indexes, actually in terms of banking penetration, you have some levels of 15, 20%. So obviously there is a need there. Another emergent trend in Africa is, and might be a real game changer in terms of innovation in the financial industry, is the mobile penetration. I mean, if you had looked to some statistics in Africa in terms of landline, if you take a snapshot in the late 90s, there were less landlines in Africa than Manhattan, for instance. And now the mobile phone is coming and is literally changing things. I mean, the penetration is getting higher. And of course, this is opening a new era for mobile banking, for mobile payment. And there is an opportunity for the continent to leapfrog in terms of access, development of financial services that are fit to the market needs on the continent. And this is happening actually. If you have a look now, so Africa is a world leader in terms of mobile services. It's exceeding, for instance, twice the size of what is happening in terms of mobile financial services in other regions such as South Asia. And what is interesting to see on the other side of this slide is that the intensity, I mean, clearly there is an improvement in terms of usage and then of these mobile money accounts in the continent, in sub-Saharan Africa especially. I want just to highlight here a concrete case. I mean, we all know about M-Pesa and MTN, two mobile operators, Vodafone and MTN, that are launching their mobile services. And actually, they are doing this. They are meeting a market demand, and they are doing money, actually. M-Pesa is making 550 million in terms of earnings in Africa, and then MTN is roughly 200. So clearly, there is a market share and some value to capture there. And it's not all, actually. We are now in the extreme right of the graph here, where we are seeing mature and also maturing countries. And just keep in mind that it's just the beginning of something bigger. Sleeping giants such as Morocco, such as Egypt, such as Nigeria are just at the beginning of this very promising trend. And hopefully in the upcoming years, we will see more developments in terms of mobile banking, mobile financial services overall in Africa. But we're also seeing, and this is a link to the previous presentation by Omar, is that it's an ecosystemic approach, meaning that we are seeing the Silicon Savannah emerging gradually in Africa, and it's at different stages. First, policymakers are putting in place the legal and regulatory framework to prepare for the optimal conditions for fintechs to emerge. Also, in terms of VC, or in terms of financing in general, we are seeing that it's developed and it's developing. We are also seeing business angels that are targeting Africa. We are seeing also fiscal incentives that are prepared so that they can accompany the development of the ecosystem. We are also seeing, in terms of capacity building, more programs in terms of education, in terms of training, masterclass, so that developers can get the financial knowledge and education so that they can leverage the opportunity. And last but not least, and this is one of the most important, is this startup and innovative culture that is embedded in the continent. We are also talking here about hackathons, about innovation labs. Microsoft, Big Tech also is coming here, but also more smaller incubators, accelerator programs. Fintechs segments are emerging, and Africa has its own particularity, meaning that it's not necessarily what you might hear in developed countries. Everybody's talking about the ABCD of fintechs, with artificial intelligence, with blockchain, with cloud, with data-driven big data, and so on. Well, don't get me wrong, this is also happening in Africa, but what we are seeing clearly is in terms of payment transfer solutions, in terms of crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, in terms of RegTech and InsurTech, in terms of microfinance, microinsurance also. So these are the game changers that are expected to boom in the upcoming years. Now that we are done with fintechs, I would like to talk about green and sustainable finance. As we are in a week of COP24 that started a couple of days ago, so it's important to remember that climate agenda also is instrumental, and that there are some innovation there as well. And we all remember this famous picture of the Paris Agreement 3 years ago, right? It sounds like it's ages ago. Several persons in the pictures are not in leadership position anymore. But still, the Paris Agreement is instrumental because it's trying to contribute to the transition to about low carbon economies. Basically, how we can move from brown economy to a green economy, and financial industry has a role to play. And one of the key pillars of the Paris Agreement was to have a paradigm where emerging countries will benefit from developing countries in terms of money transfers, in terms of technology transfer, knowledge, and so on. And there was this famous saying about 100 billion per year going from developed economies, benefiting countries in the emerging ones. And the key objectives of green and sustainable finance is to help mobilize, channel, and massify the green and sustainable finance. Obviously, we are talking here about how to align the financial system with the climate and sustainability agenda. And if you have a look to what is happening in Africa, well, actually, the trends are quite special. Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents in terms of climate change, yet it has no historical responsibility in it. In terms of global green gas emission, it's really marginal, less than 5%, and it's attracting a minor cut of climate finance flows. So obviously Africa has less than 5% in terms of global climate finance, and therefore we can see here a need and also a demand that needs to be met. And in this perspective, I would like to briefly talk to you about COP22 that took place 2 years ago in Marrakesh. And basically, it was supposed to be the COP of the action, meaning putting in place the mechanism in order to develop green finance globally and move forward with the climate agenda. So it was an opportunity to advocate for Africa, for the case of Africa in the agenda. Also, how to strengthen the pipeline of innovative, bankable projects that are going to bring added value, and also design an innovative mechanism and instruments so that we can accompany this need. And here I would like to share with you an illustration of the Noor project in Ouarzazate. Ouarzazate is a city in the south of Morocco, and it's famous because of this. So this is basically the largest solar power plant and one of the biggest in Africa. It is the beginning of a 6 billion worth investment program. And the idea is to install 500 megawatts of renewable energy. Basically, it will be huge. It will be the size of the capital, Rabat. And what you are seeing here is the first step, 160 megawatts per project, and there are 2 coming on the pipe. So what is innovative here is following. I mean, there is a solar cluster around the public-private partnership that has been built in order to develop, to design, finance, and also in terms of maintenance and operations. Also, it's involving both Moroccan, international actors with African stakeholders involved, such as the African Development Bank, in terms of financing and operation. And last but not least, it has an innovative risk-sharing mechanism. So obviously, this is giving an idea of what is the momentum and what is happening in Africa. Clearly, there is a need. If you think about it, I mean, the infrastructure gap is huge, but also just to give you an idea, in Africa, 600 million Africans has no access to electricity. So obviously, we need more of this kind of projects, small and microgrids, for instance, to light literally the continent. And of course, there is green bonds, which are innovative instruments that are here also to finance, but also not just for the financial return, but with the component in terms of environment, social, and governance. So to wrap up, actually, innovation is happening in Africa. This is the good news. It's protein-form innovation taking multiple forms. It's a mix, sometimes low and high-tech. It's an innovation in terms of how the creative offerings and value proposition offered by companies, by local actors, multinationals also are happening on the continent in terms of new financing mechanism. And this innovation momentum should be strengthened, and this is a role that policymakers, ecosystemic actors can play in order to enhance. Sure. I'm almost done. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. This mic is better, actually.